أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. Welcome to the Dictations. Inshallah, in today's discussion, we want to touch upon a very interesting topic, and a topic where we may not be able to even reach a final conclusion. And that topic has to do with what they call in the Quran al-huruf al-muqatta'a, the disjointed letters of the Quran. And the disjointed letters are basically letters that, the surahs that begin with alif, lam, mim, or yasin, taha. These letters are called the disjointed letters of the Quran. Inshallah, but before we do that, I want to just show something very interesting, and which links to our discussion on the al-huruf al-muqatta'a or al-huruf al-muqatta'at, the disjointed letters. So there was a scholar by the name of Mirza Mahdi Isfahani. Mirza Mahdi Isfahani is known to be a scholar who is known to be the founder of a school of thought known as the Tafsir. And this school of thought, which is predominantly present even today in the city of Mashhad, but there are many of their followers also in the city of Qom and elsewhere. It was a school of thought which is pretty much anti-philosophy. And they believed that the religious seminaries and the interpretations of the Quran and the Hadith, they have become way too influenced by philosophical thought. And hence Mirza Mahdi Isfahani himself was a student of philosophy and even mysticism to an extent. So apparently he sees this dream or this vision in which he sees the 12th Imam, and the Imam tells him that the way you engage with the Tafsir and the traditions is not correct because you're influenced by Greek philosophy and so on. Anyways, he changes his mind and he begins his own school of thought, which is called the Tafsir, and he was pretty influential. Anyways, he had a student, and one of his most important students, his name was Shaykh Mahmud Halabi. Shaykh Mahmud Halabi died in 1998. And Shaykh Mahmud Halabi himself was someone who was influenced initially, and he was very much into mysticism and the occult sciences and these secret, numbers and basically, cutting himself off from the communities and just going into the deserts, almost like a hermit. And he was known for this. Eventually, he meets Mirza Mahdi Isfahani and he debates him on a couple of topics, and then he gets convinced that Mirza Mahdi, his opinions are correct, and then he becomes one of his most important students. And he wrote a lot of what they call taqrirat, basically class notes that he took. And these are the most precise notes and one of the most important notes from Mirza Mahdi Isfahani's classes. This is probably happening in the late 1930s maybe, or perhaps I believe early 1940s if I'm not mistaken. And this manuscript that is on the screen right now is one of those manuscripts, is basically the class notes of Mahmud Halabi, which are preserved in the Astani Quds Razavi library in Mashhad. And they are his notes. And basically, so these are the notes that he took in class, but this is like an intro page to those notes. And he writes an introduction on that. Now, what we're trying to look at over here is that when he writes this introduction, he is really, speaking about his teacher, Mirza Mahdi Isfahani and so on. And he's basically explaining that he has recently passed away and that he was a faqih. And then over here he says, so in the middle of the page you can see it says 1365 Hijri. So over here he says, this faqih قد أخذ مواد علومه ومعارفه, that he has taken his knowledge, علومه ومعارفه وأركان مشهوداته النفسية من البحر الأعظم, صاحب العلم الجمعي سيدنا ومولانا. He is saying that this Mirza Mahdi Isfahani, our teacher, he is a faqih who took his knowledge and his basically his understanding from another great scholar who is the possessor of all knowledge, our master, our Sayyiduna wa Maulana. And then you see these bunch of letters, these cryptic letters in his notes, right? You can see these letters right in the middle. You can see Ba, Alif, Jim, Lam, Dal, Sin, Kha, Ya, Shin. So you see these, these 2.5 lines of letters that just randomly appear there. And there are these notes and interviews that are recorded. Somebody goes and asks Mahmud Halabi, like, what is this? What were you writing? And he says, well, if I really wanted to tell people, I would have written it, but I don't want to tell anyone. But apparently, in another student of Mirza Mahdi Isfahani and a close associate of Shaykh Mahmud Halabi, he actually ends up telling us what this actually says. So basically, what in this paragraph, what Shaykh Mahmud Halabi is writing, that our teacher Mirza Mahdi Isfahani would get his knowledge from he describes someone as a faqih and a jurist who has a lot of knowledge, and then he just writes a cryptic thing, and then he says that he basically says after that name, batinan wa in kana muta'alliman indahu zahiran. Okay, we're gonna try and figure out what this is saying. The reason why I'm showing this is that, look, there is this, humans love mystery. Humans love cryptic things, and then they love to decipher cryptic things. And then there's an entire world of occult sciences where certain people and scholars, they're into these letters and numbers. And because Shaykh Mahmud Halabi was part of that tradition at one point of his life anyways, it seems that influenced this piece of writing, and he decided to put these letters in this sort of a way in his notes, and these notes are preserved in Mashhad. So what did he say? What is he trying to say? So let's go to the next page where this has been deciphered for us. And this is what he's saying. He's saying that these notes, this teacher of mine, Mirza Mahdi Isfahani, is a student. He learned his ulum from Sayyid Ali al-Tustari, Muallim Shaykh al-Ansari. That he took his knowledge from who? From Sayyid Ali al-Tustari, the teacher of Shaykh Ansari. Now, how do we know this? So if you look at the letters, every other letter, if you combine it, Alif, Lam, Sin, Ya, Dal, that says As-Sayyid. Ain, Lam, Ya becomes Ali. Alif, Lam, Ta, Sin, Ta, Ra, Ya becomes At-Tustari. Mim, Ain, Lam with a Shadda. And then Mim again, Muallim, teacher. Muallim means teacher. Alif, Lam, Shin, Ya, Kha is a Shaykh. And then you have Alif, Lam, this Alif, Lam in the beginning. I haven't circled it, forgot to circle it. And then Alif again, Noon, Sad, Alif, Ra, Ya, Al-Ansari. That Mirza Mahdi Isfahani got his knowledge from Sayyid Ali al-Tustari, who was also the teacher of Shaykh Ansari. And then he says, Batinan wa in kana muta'alliman indahu zahiran. That because this Sayyid Ali Tustari, who on earth is Sayyid Ali Tustari? Sayyid Ali Tustari is a known mystic. But the problem is, Sayyid Ali Tustari is younger than Shaykh Ansari, and he would attend the classes of Shaykh Ansari. So, but over here, he's saying that Sayyid Ali Tustari was the teacher of Shaykh Ansari. So he's trying to explain that, look, Sayyid Ali al-Tustari, Zahiran, apparently, he would go sit in the classes of Shaykh Ansari, and people think that he is the student of Shaykh Ansari. And he says, yeah, this is correct. That, yeah, the fiqh and the laws, these usul al-fiqh, legal theory, these apparent things that he was learning from Shaykh Ansari, but he was actually the teacher of Shaykh Ansari when it comes to the esoteric sciences, mysticism and irfan, and he was a teacher of Shaykh Ansari. This is what he's saying. But then he continues, because now the problem is, Mirza Mahdi Isfahani lives many decades after Sayyid Ali Tustari. Sayyid Ali Tustari died like almost 100 years before Mirza Mahdi Isfahani died. So how on earth did Mirza Mahdi Isfahani become how did he get the knowledge from Shaykh Ali Tustari, Sayyid Ali Tustari? And he says in the next line, he says, he got this knowledge. So over here, وَهَذَا الْأَخْذ, and that's in the under third line, وَهَذَا الْأَخْذ وَالْإِسْتِفَادَةِ, this learning of the knowledge that Mirza Mahdi Isfahani took from Sayyid al-Tustari, لم يكن على نظام التعليم والتعلم الظاهري. It was not done based on the apparent form of learning and learning and teaching that people usually do. Rather, it was he's saying because our teacher Mirza Mahdi Isfahani lived after the death of Shaykh Sayyid Ali Tustari, so there's no way. And he's basically saying he learned this knowledge in the Alamul Arwah, so basically what's trying to say is that Mirza Mahdi Isfahani could detach his soul, and in this realm of the souls he would go and meet Sayyid Ali Tustari, and then he would learn the knowledge from him in that realm. And then this is what he's basically saying over here. This is what I wanted to start off with, because it's very interesting, and this is a claim that some of the students of Mirza Mahdi Isfahani make until today, that yes, Mirza Mahdi apparently had this ability to detach his soul and learn. As a matter of fact, even some of the articles, when they mention the students of Sayyid Ali Tustari, they mention Mirza Mahdi Isfahani's name, and they write in brackets that this was done in a form of just the souls transferring information. Anyways, this is the kind of stuff that some of these scholars write and apparently believed in. Up to you whether you want to believe this or no, because Mirza Mahdi Isfahani has been critiqued very, very strongly, and his anti-philosophical views have been critiqued. And recently his entire Mawsu'a, all of his notes by his students and stuff were published, and there's a lot of interesting critical remarks on his school of thought that are published. And inshallah, maybe in the future we're going to talk about him a little bit. What is this anti-philosophy school of thought, and are there arguments even are they even strong or not? And if Mirza Mahdi Isfahani himself was against mysticism and irfan, then he himself is basing his entire school of thought based off some vision that he saw. So wait, how does that work? So anyways, the reason why I want to start with that, because there are disjointed letters in these, and these disjointed letters make up a certain message, so they have a meaning. They look disjointed and disconnected, but they have actually a certain meaning. And hence, what we're going to do in this session is go through a tafsir of a scholar who is on the complete opposite end of Mirza Mahdi Isfahani's school of thought, and that is the contemporary Ayatullah Jawadi Amuli. Okay, and this is his Tasneem. Ayatullah Jawadi Amuli, in fact, around 2 decades ago, maybe even just over 2 decades ago, even had a debate with one of the students, or one of the main representatives of this Maktab Tafkik, which is the school of anti-philosophy. They had a very famous debate, and the debate has been published and transcribed and everything. It is available online in Farsi, and it happened in Mashhad. Ayatollah Jawadi is the complete opposite school of thought, which is pure philosophy and mysticism. And he is also one of the most famous mufassirin of the Quran, Shi'i mufassirin of the Quran today. So just like we had Allamah Tabataba'i at a certain time, today Agha Jawadi's tafsir is known to be one of the most important tafsir, a work which is being, I believe, so the tafsir is done, but the books are still being published. So he used to give his tafsir, his lessons in the Haram, and they turned them into basically transcribed them, and then they published them. So these are in Farsi, and there are also Arabic translations of it also being published. And so what are we going to do with him? Why am I choosing this tafsir in particular? Because when it comes to the discussion of the disjointed letters, the Alif, Lam, Mim, Yasin, Hamim, Taha, all of these, he does a very nice, what they call takhrij. Takhrij means he has gathered all the opinions of the ulama on this topic. And that is a very important thing for a scholar to do when it comes to any research, anything that you want to investigate and research, the first thing you should try to do is do a takhrij, meaning figure out what are the different opinions on this. Figure out all the scholars, all the opinions on that topic, and then you can basically go and start your research on it. So what does he do? He begins in volume 2, obviously in Surah Al-Baqarah. The first ayah is Alif Lam Mim. So he begins this discussion by analyzing these 20 opinions, and he will go through each and every single opinion, and he will give his comments or observations and critiques on it. We're going to try and go through all of them, and we'll see whether we can finish all of them in this one session, or do we need to take a break and do this over 2 sessions. I'm not sure right now. But before we do that, he mentions a couple of generic points about these letters, general features about these letters. He says, look, these letters are specific to the Quran, meaning the previous revealed books, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Bible. Those works do not have anything like this. So these are, what is the problem here, right? Like why are we talking about this? We're saying that there are a bunch of surahs that begin with certain letters that have no immediate meaning for us. Just like the letters that were in the manuscript of Mahmud Halabi, they didn't mean anything to us until until the person who knew the information, they told us. Otherwise, it would have been difficult for us to figure it out. So likewise, there are some letters in the beginning of some of the surahs of the Quran that mean nothing to us. Alif Lam Mim. And the thing is, the Quran is supposed to be this light, and Allah asks us to contemplate over it, and that its meanings are very clear and so on. So what is this? What is this Alif Lam Mim? What does it even mean? And how come we don't know the answer? Nobody decided to ask the Prophet, like, what is this? So he says these letters are specific to the Quran. And he also says that, look, they are not specific to the Meccan surahs or to the Madani surahs. You will find them both in the Makki surahs and also Madani surahs. So Surah Baqarah is Madani. It starts with Alif Lam Mim. He says there are 27 Meccan chapters in which these letters are mentioned. And there are also 2 Madani surahs in which basically these are mentioned. And he says that when you look at these surahs, the beginning of the chapters, the disjointed letters, they range from 1 to 5 letters. So for example, one of them, surah can begin with Noon. That's one of the surahs that begins with Noon, right? And that's just one letter. But then you have some that have Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad. Okay, so these are basically 5 letters. Or some of them have 3 letters, like Alif Lam Ra, Alif Lam Mim, Ta, Sin, Mim. These are 3 letters. So you have letters range from 1 to 5. Some of them, so according to some scholars, some of them have been considered a verse of their own. So for example, Alif Lam Mim, verse 1, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. Some of them considered it to be like that. Some of them said no, it's all one ayah. Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. Some of the Mufassirin and the scholars of Quran said no, this is all one ayah. So this is just a point that he's mentioning here. And then he says there are 14 letters in total. So when you collect all the letters together and you remove all the repetitions, you end up with 14 letters in total. And then he says an interesting point, and I think he could have brought this as one of the opinions that exists as well. So because he brings 20 opinions, he could have brought this as the 21st opinion, but it seems that he considers it so weak that he didn't even want to entertain it as a legitimate opinion. But the interesting thing is, there are some pretty credible scholars who claim this. So I think he could have brought it as a 21st opinion, but in his opinion, this is so whack that he's like, why is this even, I'm not even going to bother discussing this. So he says, look, some of the Mufassirin have said that this, when you put the 14 letters together, what you get is actually a statement that says, Siratu aliyin haqqun numsikuhu. He says, when you put these letters together, you can make this sentence, that the path of Ali is the haqq, it's the correct, and we hold on to it, and we attach ourselves to it. Or he says, some people said, you can also say, Aliyun haqqun numsikuhu siratuhu, numsik siratuhu, that Ali is the truth and we hold steadfast or hold strongly to his path. He says, look, this is not a very strong thing to say, because he's like, look, there's an Ahl Sunnah scholar like Shaykh Alusi, very, very important scholar, Alusi. He has a tafsir called Ruh al-Ma'ani. He says, Alusi brings this claim of the Shias, and then he says, well, okay, if you want to play it that way, well, I can also say something. And he says, I can reword this statement and say, Sahha tariquka ma'a sunnah, that your path is only going to be correct if you are with the Sunnah. And hence, he says, well, I can also use this, play around with the words, and now I have defended the school of the Ahl Sunnah school of thought. So Ayatullah Jawadi is saying, look, there's no point trying to make these combinations and saying, well, look, it's making something that is in favor of the Shias. He's like, look, the Ahl Sunnah can take the same thing and make something out of it. Interestingly, it would be interesting if somebody puts this in this AI chat GPT or some sort of word generator and see what kind of combinations we can get out of this. That would be interesting. If somebody wants to do that and throw it in the comments, that would be pretty cool to see. Like, what do you get out of it? So Ayatullah Jawadi says, look, don't waste time on this. This is not anything. This is not a solid opinion or a way to say that this is what the ayat mean. This is what these letters mean. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to slowly start going through each of his opinions one by one. And yeah, so it's going to take some time. We're going to go through them, and I'm going to try and explain every single one of them. And he is discussing this over, he starts on page 70, and it's ending almost at page 100 and almost at like page 130, page 128. Right, so even before page 69, he's starting from, the whole section starts from like page 50 something. So yeah, page 63. So it's a very long discussion, over 40-50 pages. And he's going to mention each opinion one by one, explain it. He's going to explain it. He explains it in a lot of depth, and then he also critiques it. I'm going to try and summarize it. Obviously, I'm not going to translate the whole thing. I just want to go through the opinions. He says, look, the very first opinion that ulama have said that what these letters mean is that these letters are from what they say the huruf, which are the ayat, which are mutashabih. Mutashabih means that these, because there's an ayah in the Quran in Surah Al Imran, ayah number 7, that where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, look, huwa alladhi anzala alayka al-kitab, that he is the one who has revealed the book. Minhu ayatun muhkamat, there are some ayat in which are very clear. Hunna ummul kitab wa ukhra mutashabihat, while there are some ayat which are ambiguous. They have a meaning, but you could possibly understand multiple meanings from it. And what you have to do is take those mutashabih ayat, the ones that have multiple possible meanings, and you revert them back to the muhkamat ayat. And then you will be able to figure out what did that ayah mean. He says the first opinion is that these ayat are mutashabih, because we don't know what they mean. And his answer is very straightforward. He's like, look, when we call something mutashabih, right? Mutashabih means that a verse or a word actually has a meaning. For example, if I say, I saw a lion, lion could mean either the animal lion, or it could mean a courageous person. Meaning it could be a literal meaning, or I could have been using it in a metaphorical meaning. So the word might become mutashabih. But the point is that it actually has a meaning. You're just not sure which one is the meaning. He is saying you cannot call these ayat mutashabih because they don't even mean anything. Alif Lam Mim, I'm not getting any meaning. So there's no meaning to begin with, and hence why you cannot call these ayat mutashabih ayat. Right? Because ayat, mutashabih ayat are ayat that have a meaning. You can understand the meaning, but is a possibility, like it has multiple meanings and you don't know which is the correct one. That's how he responds to this. He's like, these are not mutashabih ayat. So that's the first opinion. Okay, second opinion. He says the second opinion is the opinion of Shaykh Tusi and other ulama. Shaykh Tusi, our Shi'i scholar, he says that he also mentions the name of Muhammad Abdo and Rashid Rida in their Tafsir al-Manar. He references everything at the bottom. That the disjointed letters are the names of each surah. And I believe even this, what's his name? Dr. Ghamidi, I believe his name is, right? The famous, Dr. Jawad Ahmad Ghamidi from Pakistan. He also has his opinion. Dr. Jawad Ahmad Ghamidi has the same opinion. He says these are just the names of the surahs. So Alif Lam Mim is the name of, we decided to call it Surah Baqarah. Even though there's only one ayah maybe about Baqarah, there's a story about a Baqarah in there, but the entire Surah Baqarah has nothing to do with a Baqarah. It's like 200 plus, more than 250 ayat. The whole surah has nothing to do with the Baqarah. Maybe there's one story of the Baqarah in it, but people decide to call it, the surah in which the Baqarah is mentioned. So he says, look, these names are already, chosen by people anyways. But what Allah wanted to call this surah was actually Surah Alif Lam Mim. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. So he says this. Now, Shaykh Tusi also says this. He says, if someone asks, how can it be that these verses which are part of the chapter can be the name of the chapter itself? So these are ayat. How can they become names of the chapter? So otherwise you're saying these are just title tags. They're not actually the surahs. He says, look, our answer will be that this is just like Surah Al-Baqarah or Surah Ali Imran, in which the Baqarah or Ali Imran are found within that chapter. And yet they are the names of the chapter itself. So he's saying, look, in Surah Baqarah, isn't the word Baqarah mentioned in the surah? Well, it is, but it's also the name of the surah. So likewise, you have Alif Lam Mim in the surah, and it's also the name of the surah. He said, what's wrong with this? Just like that, Alif Lam Mim can be part of the chapter, and the name of the chapter at the same time. This is what Shaykh Tusi, he's calling Shaykh Tusi over here. His answer to that is that, look, he's saying, okay, it's not impossible. It's not impossible. But there is no proof against. He says, look, there is no proof for this claim. Right? There's no proof. He says, look, I admit that there's no proof against it either. It's not like I have some evidence that says, no, this view of yours is wrong. That I have a proof that, look, this is not what these ayat mean. He says, look, I cannot say that. It's not like I have some rational argument or some textual evidence. But at the same time, you can't prove it either. So what does it become? It becomes just a possibility. You just basically gave me a possible meaning of this, but possibility is just a possibility. You cannot say with certainty this is what the ayat mean. And you will notice that he will do this quite a lot in these 20 opinions. He will say, look, I don't necessarily have an argument against this opinion, but I also don't have an argument for this opinion. And hence why it just remains in the realm of possibilities. Okay. Opinion number 3. He says these are names of the Quran. Just like the Quran has other names like Al-Furqan, Al-Dhikr, Al-Kitab. Likewise, he says one of the names of the Quran are these letters. Alif Lam Mim, Ha Mim, Taha, Yasin. He gives this opinion. And he's quoting in Majmu' al-Bayan. He says in Majmu' al-Bayan, this is quoted. He's not saying the author of Majmu' al-Bayan believes in this, but he's just saying this is what Allamah Tabataba'i in Majmu' al-Bayan has also mentioned as an opinion. Once again, he says there is no proof against or for this claim. He says, in fact, I may be able to show you a proof against it. And that is, if it is basically when you're saying this is just another name for the Quran, I should be able to replace that word with the word Quran itself. So for example, if Allah says, I have revealed the Furqan to you, or I have revealed the Dhikr to you, if you replace that Dhikr and mention the word Quran, the meaning doesn't change. I have revealed the Quran to you, it's the same thing. Likewise, if we say Alif Lam Mim is just the name of the Quran, and we say if we say Alif Lam Mim ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. He says, well, or Taha or Yasin. He says, look, it doesn't make any sense because we don't know what the letters mean to begin with for you to come and say this is a synonym for it. So you cannot replace it. You cannot say Taha, you cannot say Al-Quran, and then go on with the rest of the surah. It doesn't make sense for him. That's what he's saying. Like Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad. He says you cannot say Al-Quran, Dhikru Rahmati Rabbika. Right? He says you cannot do this. It doesn't make any sense. And in fact, he says, even if it makes sense to you, it does not. The people who hold the opinion, they themselves don't accept this. Like they will say, no, you cannot just replace this and put the word Quran in and it will somehow have the same meaning. He said this is a response that he can give to them. This is one of the shortest opinion he addresses. The fourth opinion he says, so now the fourth and the fifth ones are going to get a little bit complicated. And I'm going to try and summarize these briefly. He says, look, the fourth opinion is that each and every single letter in these huruf are basically signifying one of God's names. And some of them have even said that they're indicating the Prophet's names. The huruf, the letters, therefore, are basically codes or abbreviations. So, for example, Alif Lam Mim. He says, for example, Alif Lam Mim. It becomes. They're saying Alif in Alif Lam Mim is taken from the word Allah, and the Mim is taken from the end of the word, like Al-Alim or Al-Hakim and Al-Rahim. So he says each of these are indicating some of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says that, look, the people who believe in this, they will quote something from their poetry. They will say, look, it is known in the Arab poetry that sometimes they will use a letter to in an abbreviated form, where the letter itself means something else. And he quotes a poem or a statement which says, Kafa bis-sayfi sha. Kafa bis-sayfi sha translates into, the sword will be sufficient as a healer. The sword is enough to basically heal. And he says the word sha over here, the letter sha, the letter sheen, is actually an abbreviated form for shafiya. Kafa bis-sayfi shafiya. Shafi, meaning the one who can heal. They don't want to say the whole word shafi. So what did they say? They just put the letter sheen. So he's quoting, he's like, look, proponents quote this. And then he says Ibn Sina, Avicenna, he also held this opinion. He says, yes, the huruf are indicating certain things. And what he says is that, look, each letter is indicating, basically the philosophers had their own worldview of how the cosmos is created. They believed in the different intellects. They believe in, the first intellect, the second intellect, and so on. And therefore, he says that each of these letters are basically indicating. So he says Alif is referring to Allah. The Ba is referring to the first intellect. The Jim is looking to the universal nafs. Dal is looking at referencing the natural world, and so on. Or, for example, some of them have said that the Lam in Alif Lam Mim is an ishara to the Aql Fa'al, which is Jibreel. So they have this idea that there's something called the active intellect. And they say the active intellect is basically Jibreel. That's what Jibreel was. That's maybe when we talk about the reality of revelation in one of the dictations, inshallah, we'll talk about it. What is the reality of revelation? And we'll discuss the views of the philosophers. Over there, this will become a little bit more clear. What is this 10th intellect and the first intellect, and what is this Jibreel doing over here? That's what Ibn Sina is basically saying. But what does Agha Jawadi say? He says, look, Agha Jawadi is saying that, look, if you are saying that these letters are just abbreviated forms which are indicating the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, what's the point of that? Because these names are already there in the Quran. It's not like you're hiding anything. If Alif indicates Allah and Lam indicates, Mim indicates Al-Alim and Al-Hakim and Al-Rahim, well, these names are already mentioned. They're not even, you make something a code, or you make something abbreviated and like a secret thing when you don't want it to be known. Whereas these are already known. So what are you trying to hide over here? That's his response. He's basically trying to question the wisdom behind it. And then of course he also says that there are some narrations that prove this. So he's not saying that this is just something you made up. He's saying, look, I agree that there are narrations that also indicate that some of these letters mean something else. So some of the narrations, at the end of this discussion, he talks about the narrations. We'll try to go through them very briefly. There are narrations that say, well, this letter means this letter means Allah, this letter means Ar-Rahim. He says, look, these narrations are generally very, very weak. You cannot use weak narrations. Some of them barely have any chains of transmitters in them, and their status is very, very weak. He says we cannot use those and arrive at some sort of a conclusive belief about these ayat. So therefore he says basically that these are very weak explanations. But then he has opinion number 5, which is interesting. He says that the 5th opinion says that that when you put these letters together form what they call al-Ism al-A'zam, the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, what's the difference between this and the previous view? The previous view is saying that each letter on its own indicates one of the names of Allah, one of the attributes of Allah. This opinion number 5, is saying that no, when you put these words together, they end up creating the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have to put them together. Ayatullah Jawadi critiques this. He says, look, number 1, there's no evidence to support this view. And second, he says that, look, when we say something is the name of Allah or the al-Ism al-A'zam, the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, look, names can be of 2 types. When we say there's an al-Ism al-A'zam of Allah, we're not talking about these letters and the letters that are written on a book or something that is in our mind. He says we're not talking about that. We're not talking about Ar-Rahman, meaning you write Ar-Rahman and somehow that's what al-Ism al-A'zam is. He says there's 2 types of words when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One is the letters, and these letters and the way you construct them, these are our constructions. We decide to write Ar-Rahman like this, or we decide to say Rahman has to be spelled in this way, and so on. We are the ones who created these letters and this language. The al-Ism al-A'zam is an existential name. The one, for example, that is attributed in Dua Kumail, وَبِأَسْمَائِكَ الَّتِي مَلَأَتْ أَرْكَانَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. The Asma, your names have filled up everything in this cosmos. Those names that have filled everything up in this cosmos are not these letters. Those are existential names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says that the al-Ism al-A'zam, that is basically the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's that existential name, not these letters. The letters that are written in a book. It's like that's not what we mean when we say somebody possesses the knowledge of the Ism al-A'zam, the greatest name. We don't mean to say that they know the word Ar-Rahman and or Allah or Ar-Rab and so on. It's like that's not what we mean by that. And he says that the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, including the greatest names, Al-Alim and Al-Hakim and Allah and Ar-Rab, Allah being the most important name, these are already mentioned in the Quran. So basically he's saying the Ism al-A'zam is already mentioned in the Quran. These are all, the names of Allah. And he says the greatest names of Allah are also mentioned in the Quran already. So there's nothing secret about these letters where you're going to say, well, you put them together and you're going to discover the greatest name of Allah. The greatest name of Allah is already there. It's called Allah or Ar-Rab or Ar-Rahman, whatever. There's different opinions on that, or different narrations on it as well. But the point is, whatever that name happens to be, that name is already in the Quran. And maybe not even once, multiple times. So he says that, look, this is once again, opinion that is there, but it's not as strong as you may make it seem like. So he critiques this as well. The 6th opinion that he presents. He says, look, there's a 6th opinion that some scholars have said that these letters are basically oaths that Allah is taking. So they are like a qasam. So when Allah says, by the sun and by the moon, or by the fig and the olive. So these are qasams that Allah is taking. Some people said that these letters are also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking a qasam. And that when there's a qasam, obviously there's some sort of a importance given to whatever is whatever you're taking a qasam for. Al-Jawadi says, look, fair enough, it could be a qasam, but there's no proof for this claim. You are just constantly talking about possible meanings. Possible meanings are not enough for us to have a certain view about a certain ayah of the Quran. He says, look, firstly, this is just a possibility. I have nothing to negate it. I have nothing to prove it either. But he says, look, in fact, maybe I can negate it. And I can negate it, or I can belittle the possibility of this by saying that, look, when you take an oath, you're usually taking an oath to remove a doubt from something. So, for example, you say, by Allah, such and such has happened. So why are you taking an oath? Because some people may have a doubt that a certain event has happened. So you do a qasam to make sure people have no doubt. He says, well, this is a qasam. Well, what doubt are they removing? As a matter of fact, they are sending us even in more doubt because we don't know what the letters even mean. And that's why we're confused about it. So he says, does it make sense for you to call it or consider it a qasam? Then he says there's a seventh opinion. And the seventh opinion is that when you can convert these letters into what they call the abjad numerical system. So in this, there's an entire discussion on how letters correspond to certain numbers. And this is called the abjad numerical system. There's a whole discussion on this. And he says that some people say that when you convert these letters into their numbers, into their number equivalents, they signify events in the future, such as the destruction of civilizations. And he says, as a matter of fact, some narrations also mention this. And he references the narrations at the bottom, that some narrations actually mention this. He says, look, his response is that, look, these narrations are weak. They are solitary reports. You cannot build any certainty off of these. So therefore, he weakens. It basically says, look, this is a view based off of the narrations, and hence, the narrations are all weak over there. روایاتی که مؤید این قول است اعتبارش معلوم نیست. He says even though the numerical system and how the letters correspond with certain letters, numbers, he says, look, that itself is a science that is probably valid, and there are people who believe in it and it's valid. He says, there's no evidence to negate that science, but it doesn't mean that what you're claiming is also true. So he's making that distinction over here. Then there's an eighth opinion, he says. He says the eighth opinion is that when you convert these numbers into their numerical values, they will tell you the time that is left for the survival of the Islamic Ummah, the Muslim Ummah. Once again, he says that there is no proof for this. And in fact, as a matter of fact, the Quran says no person and no nation will know when their end is going to be. So when Allah is saying no one's going to ever know when the end's going to be, that means no one's ever going to know. So if you're telling me, no, there's a way to figure it out, well then that negates the ayahs of the Quran where Allah says no one's going to know. So that's how he goes through this very quickly. The ninth opinion says, once again, this is also a short one. Ninth opinion says that these letters have just been brought forth to provide examples of the Arabic letters. Yani, this is a very strange opinion. Who even said this? He's like, yeah, they've just been mentioned as an example of the Arabic letters. Even the view is not very clear. And he says, okay. Al Jawadi is saying, well, what does that even mean? He himself is saying, what does that even mean? Doesn't really explain anything. We're trying to figure out what do they mean. So you're just telling me they're Arabic letters. Okay, what's the point? He's like, why is Allah just bringing 14 letters then? There's more than 14 letters. So why just stick to 14? Yani, he's just like, I don't think he's just like not even interested in this one, because only two. He doesn't even explain it properly. He just mentions it in one line. He's like, move on. Okay. Then you have the 10th opinion. The 10th opinion says that, and this is an opinion that many of us have probably heard. I know when, as kids we would go to Sunday school and stuff, we were told this, that these letters are just letters that the Prophet would say to grab the attention of the disbelievers. Right? And this, I'm sure, Many of us have heard this. And, he even quotes the ayat of the Quran where he says, the mushrikeen, they don't want to listen to the Quran and they make this noise so nobody can hear the Quran. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given these letters for the Prophet to go maybe on a hill or some mountain, and he screams out, Alif, Lam, Mim, and people just look at him saying, what are you saying? So it kind of grabs people's attention. And this is a view that is, very, very common. A lot of people sort of just go with this view. But Ayatullah Jawadi in his tafsir, he says, look, number one, in vaj yek ihtimal sarf ast ke dalili bar isbat an wujud nadare. This is just a possibility, it's a possible view, but there is no proof for it. There is nothing that says this is what these letters are for. Once again, he says, I'm not saying there is something that also refutes it. It's not like we have something in the narrations where somebody asks the Imam, oh Imam, are these letters for this reason? And the Imam says, no, they're not. He says, we don't have any evidence to negate it, but there's no evidence to prove it either. He says, on top of that, the place where the mushrikeen would not listen to the Prophet mostly was in Mecca. And majority of the Meccan surahs don't really have these letters. Yes, from the surahs that have the letters, majority of them happen to be Makki, but then there are dozens and dozens of Makki surahs that don't have these letters. So, well, if this was going to happen in Mecca, how come all the other surahs don't have it? Or a vast majority of Meccan surahs should have at least had it. Then on top of that, there are some Madani surahs that also have these letters, where people are supposedly listening, after the Hijrah and so on, they're listening. Thirdly, he says that even if the Prophet said these letters, there was still nothing stopping the disbelievers from ignoring the Quran and not listening to the Quran. Like, what's so complicated about Prophet saying Alif Lam Mim, but still the mushrikeen are saying, oh, be quiet, don't listen to the Prophet. And then his fourth opinion, he says that his fourth critique is that, listen, there is nothing in the entire history that we have, recorded history, where it actually says that the Prophet would go recite these letters to grab people's attention. He says we don't have anything. It is just a possibility that someone in history may have come up with. And it sounds sort of good, and they went with it. Most people went with it. So that's how he negates this entire position. This position is not reliable, or there's no strong evidence for it, essentially. Right? So then the next opinion, which is the 11th opinion. So we still have, there's 20. So we've gone halfway. He says, let's look at the 11th opinion. And he says the 11th opinion is very similar to the 9th opinion. And this one is an interesting one. This is something that, it's worth considering. He says these letters were brought forth as examples of the Arabic letter, but not just to show that these are Arabic letters, as opinion number 9 was saying, right? Opinion number 9 was saying. Rather, they are being brought in to serve as a challenge of the miracle of the Quran. And he says that if you look at most of the ayat that begin right after these disjointed letters, so as a matter of fact, he says all of them except Surah Ankabut, Surah Maryam, Surah Rum, and Surah Qalam. If you remove these four, the rest, Surah Baqarah, Surah Al Imran, Surah Luqman, Surah Ghafir, Surah Fussilat, he says all of them, right after the disjointed letters, there's something mentioned about the Quran. For example, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. Alif Lam Mim, نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ بِالْحَقِّ. ألف لام ميم تلك آيات الكتاب الحكيم. حاميم تنزيل الكتاب. حاميم تنزيل من الرحمن الرحيم. So every, each of these letters, right after that, there's something about the Quran. So these letters are being brought in as a challenge for the mushrikeen, that if you can, Allah is using these very same letters to produce this challenging and to produce this miraculous book. If you are capable, then come and use these very same letters and produce something that is similar to it. And hence these letters become a tahaddi, a challenge for the mushrikeen to come and produce something like that. This is an interesting opinion. And Ayatullah Jawadi says, look, this opinion, maybe there are some observations on it, but fil jumla, generally speaking, qabil qabulas is something that we can, definitely accept, but we don't have a very strong proof for this opinion either. We don't have anything in the narrations or anything from within the Quran that solidly, really demonstrates and proves this and ends this discussion for us. Right? He says, look, we don't have anything against this opinion either, but we don't have anything that solidly proves it. This is basically, if you go with this opinion, this is just called istihsan. It just sounds very nice. It sounds very good. So it probably is true. And these are, that way of argument is something that a lot of people do. A lot of people who are not trained in logic and critical thinking and they're not very precise, a lot of their day-to-day activities and ideas and beliefs and decisions that they make are istihsanat. This just sounds good, sounds nice, it appears good, so we're going to go with it. And you cannot do it in these type of discussions in Quran and Hadith. You have to have some level of itminan and certainty. So look, even though this sounds very good, and when you look at it, wow, subhanallah, after each of these ayat, there's something mentioned about the Quran. And this is like a challenge to the mushrikeen to come and use these same letters to come and produce something like the Quran. Allah Jawadi says, yes, this is an acceptable view, but we don't have a very strong, certain evidence for it. It's just very speculative. And hence why he's a little bit hesitant to really just say, well, this is the opinion. So he leaves it at that. Then you have the 12th opinion. The 12th opinion, he says that this is also interesting. He says the letters that are in the beginning of the surah, if you go and count those letters in the chapter itself, you're going to realize that those letters are used majority of the times in that specific surah. So for example, the calculation that they did in one of the surahs, they said if you look at Alif Lam Mim Sad, Surah Al-A'raf, and then you go and you look at how many times is Alif used in that surah, how many times was Lam used, how many times was Mim used in it, how many times was Sad used in that surah. He says if you look at it, and he has the numbers. He says Alif is used 2,500 times, Lam is used 1,500 times, Mim is used 1,100 times, Sad is used 97 times. Altogether, 5,320 times these surahs have been used, and they compose 37% of the surah. And when you look at the rest of the letters, apparently it's more than the rest of the surahs. This is what he's saying. He's saying apparently this is how it is. And then he says, and so that's the opinion. So the opinion is that these letters appear the most in those chapters. He says that, look, if this is definitely proven, if somebody goes and investigates truly this opinion, this position, and looks into it, and we see the evidence for it, he says perhaps this is going to establish a linguistic miracle of the Quran. Okay? But he says that the problem is someone has to really, really use a proper methodology to go and do this research. So he's saying apparently no one has really done any research on this, or he's not so convinced by the research that has been done at that time. But he is saying that if this is done, it's going to prove the linguistic miracle of the Quran. Then you have the 13th opinion. He says that these verses, Alif Lam Mim or Yasin, are just revealed to distinguish between the end of the previous chapter and the beginning of the next chapter. Al-Jawadi says, well, why do you need Alif Lam Mim? The Bismillah Rahman Rahim is enough to make that distinction. And secondly, why do only 29 surahs of the Quran have these letters then? Why not all 112, 13 surahs of the Quran, 114 surahs? Why don't all of them have these letters in the beginning? Why just... So, these opinions are not strong. The 14th opinion says that these letters, so now you're going to start noticing that these explanations become weaker and weaker, and they don't even make sense, some of them. The 14th opinion says that these are these letters are like the summary of the contents of the chapter that they are appearing in. Agha Jawadi says, well, firstly, why are only 29 chapters being summarized? And secondly, if they are a summary of the chapter, well, they don't really serve any purpose because we don't understand what they mean. Right? So that's what he says. He's like, how are they a summary? Like, it's a summary if you can understand what it's saying, but we don't even know. The whole point is we don't know what these letters mean. So what do you mean they're a summary? And how did you figure out it's a summary? Then opinion number 15 is that these letters are like a muqaddama. They're like a preface and like an intro for the chapters of the Quran. Once again, he gives the exact same argument. He says, look, there's no evidence. If it's an introduction, then why only 29 chapters? Why not all the surahs? And secondly, if they are an intro or a preface, then we don't understand the meanings. So what's the point? They don't really serve the purpose. Now, in opinion number 16, he says the opinion of the Orientalists. This is an interesting one, and he sheds light on some of the Orientalist opinions, but there are other opinions by Western Orientalists which he doesn't go into. There are a couple other opinions, but the one he mentions is that these letters are the names of the people who possessed the Quranic codex or the Quranic manuscript. For example, the letter Sin stands for Sa'ad bin Abu Qais, or the letter Mim stands for Mughira bin Shu'bah. And he says a couple of Orientalists have put forth this theory. He says, according to him, he says this is the most far-fetched opinion. Secondly, why is it the most far-fetched opinion? He says because this would imply that the Quran has been modified. So obviously he's taking the fact that the Quran is not being altered and there's no tahrif in the Quran. There's nothing extra added in the Quran. Therefore, this opinion cannot be correct. He says that, look, what we do know from recorded history is that the Prophet also read these letters in the Quran. So if the Prophet is also reading these letters, that indicates that these are not names for the people who possess the manuscript. Rather, these are part of the ayahs of the Quran. That's the general understanding and narrative. So he says, look, this discredits this whole theory. And then he says that, look, if people did want to write their names on the manuscript in the Quranic codex, they will be written on the back of the manuscript, back cover of it or on the front of it, like it has been done with all other manuscripts. Nobody writes their name in the beginning of the chapter of the text of a book. Nobody does that, is what he's trying to say. There is this other, not really an Orientalist. He's kind of like, you can consider him to be an Orientalist, meaning his research style is Orientalist. He was Libyan, Libyan, not really like a scholar, if you want, depending how you describe scholarship. He was a Libyan academic. Sadeq Naihoum, his name was Sadeq Naihoum. He died in 94. He lived from 1937 to 1994. He had also a very interesting theory. So the reason why I'm throwing him here with the Orientalists is because it's a very similar theory. Not even though he believes these are revealed ayat of the Quran. So unlike the Western Orientalists who are just saying, no, these are just names of the people who possess the manuscript, he is saying something along the lines of these letters are letters that the Jewish community understood, because these letters indicated basically they had meaning for the Jewish mystical tradition. Within the Jewish mystical and Jewish esoteric tradition, they had a certain meaning. And he has an entire discussion on this. In his book is a book called Islam Diddul Islam, where he's trying to revisit Islam. He's trying to say, look, Islam had a certain message. He's against the mainstream views of Islam. Basically, he says, the legal side has been prioritized too much, and we've kind of lost track of the crux of Islam, which was to be a follower of Ibrahim alayhi salam and have this deen, pure deen, and so on. Anyways, in that book, he goes into this discussion in the second chapter, and he says that these letters are actually indicating this, it's a reference to certain practices in the Jewish mystical tradition, and he goes into a lot of detail, and then he makes a difference between how the mystical traditions in the Jewish community were known to be the occult sciences, where the mystical traditions were hidden, the rituals were hidden and kept secret from people, whereas the Quran very openly announces that no, these are not secrets. These are things that all humans have access to, and they should all be participating in these sort of devotional acts and so on. Anyways, he goes into a lot of detail. I don't want that itself probably is a dictation on its own, his entire book. It's a pretty interesting book. Anyways, I wanted to mention that here because it is almost like the Orientalist take, because he says the letters that are mentioned, he says there's 14 letters. He says these are the same letters that existed in the Kinaani tribe, and they did not have other letters. The letters that are used in these huruf al-muqatta'a, the 14 letters, are the letters that tribe would use, which was a Jewish tribe, and therefore this is talking to them and so on. Anyways, he builds that entire argument over there. The 17th opinion is that these letters are they are indicating the number of ayat contained within the chapters of the Quran. So they are just indicating how many ayat are in the Quran. He says this is also an istihsan, just a feel good explanation. وَفَاقِدِ الدَّلِيلَ, it doesn't have any dalil, doesn't have any evidence. Right? So he's like, what the heck? Like, what is this? 85. He said 85 chapters don't have these letters. They don't start with these letters. But there's very few that do, and only those surahs decide to tell you how many numbers of ayat are contained within that chapter of the Quran. Doesn't make any sense, he's saying. The 18th opinion is by, he's transmitting from a scholar named Abu Bakr Tabrizi. This is an interesting one that requires a slight, explanation. There came a debate in the Muslim world in 2nd, 3rd century, in the Abbasid era. Is the Quran created or is it uncreated? And that is an entire discussion. What was the point of that debate? Why did that debate happen? People were killed and tortured over that debate. Is the Quran created or is it uncreated? Anyways, that's a different discussion. But this proponent is saying that because Allah knew in the future that this debate is going to happen, that people are going to argue, is the Quran created or was it not created? And that some people are going to claim that the Quran is uncreated. Therefore, Allah added these letters at the beginning of the chapters of the Quran so that people know that the Quran is not created. Sorry, it's not uncreated, because it is made up of letters. And hence, since it is made up of letters, therefore it has been created. Okay? Meaning it did not externally exist before. Now when the letters are there, you put the letters together, now it becomes created. Al-Jawadi says that this evidence, this position, has absolutely no rational or textual evidence. This is just his mere speculation that Allah knew something's going to happen in the future and therefore he decided to put this in here. Of course Allah knew what was going to happen, but how did you link that with what these letters are meant to mean? Secondly, he says those people who believe that the Quran is uncreated, they also believe that these letters are uncreated. Just like the rest of the Quran is uncreated, they also say, yes, these letters are also uncreated. Right? So Al-Jawadi is like, what kind of a position is this? The ones who are saying the entire Quran is uncreated, well then they will also say that the letters are uncreated. So your argument is not strong at all. So he dismisses that as well, as opinion number 18. Then you have the second last opinion, and this was the view of Allamah Tabataba'i as well, and he seems to have accepted this opinion. He says that the chapters that contain the disjointed letters have very similar content with each other, and that this relationship of similarity doesn't just happen in all the chapters of the Quran. For example, Surah Falaq may have nothing to do with Surah Al-Fatiha. Two different themes, two different content, different content. But when you look at the contents of the surahs that have these letters in the beginning, he is saying that the content is very, very similar. That means they possess some sort of relationship. Okay? Now, what is that relationship and how do they indicate it? he says only the Prophet knows, right? Or the Imams, for example. They're going to know what exactly that relationship is. And Allamah Tabataba'i himself also believes that these letters don't have an immediate meaning for us. They're outside the realm of meaning. And if they, the fact that they do have some meaning is not accessible to us, only the Prophet and the Imams, they can access these meanings. What does Agha Jawadi say? Agha Jawadi says, of course, that this opinion of Allamah Tabataba'i is valuable and it is a interesting opinion. And there are also some shawahid, some contextual evidence that supports this view. But he says that we need to spend time and really then investigate the contents of each chapter. Because it's possible that there are other chapters that also have similar content to the ones that have the letters in them. And yet there are some chapters that don't have those letters in them. Right? So, because you cannot just say, well, the surahs that have the letters in them contain similar content. Because how do you then explain certain surahs that don't have the letters, but yet have similar content? So why did Allah not put the letters on those surahs as well? So Agha Jawadi is saying, look, we really have to come up with a methodology over here and really determine what do we mean by similar content, number one. And, then basically go and investigate this. So that's what he says. And then he says the final opinion. Final opinion, he says, and he will use this final opinion to go into the discussion of Ibn Arabi and the Urafat, the mystics, and how they have understood it. But then he says, their understanding is not hujjah on us. But then he explains it anyways. What did the mystics, and particularly Ibn Arabi, what did he believe about this? But before we do that, he's saying that the 20th opinion is that the knowledge of the meaning of these letters is something that Allah knows and the Prophet knows. And it is not meant to be understood by others. He says, look, you cannot say it is not meant to be understood. Because if Allah is saying in the Quran to do tadabbur on the Quran, well, Alif Lam Mim is part of the Quran. And Hamim is part of the Quran. So that means we have been told to do tadabbur on it. So you cannot say it's not even meant to be understood. Yes, some statements and some words have layers of meanings, and if we don't have the prerequisites for it, we may not be able to understand it. It doesn't mean that they don't have any meaning or we can never understand them. If we have certain prerequisites, we could then access those meanings. Sometimes he says that contemplation can also happen by recognizing that you need to refer to someone else to figure out what the meaning is. So you can contemplate on these ayat by referring to the Prophet and the Imams, and when they tell you what these ayat mean, you can contemplate on them. So he's trying to give these two sort of takes on this. He says, look, yes, fair enough, the Prophet understands it, and we cannot understand it, but doesn't mean we are never meant to understand it. He says this is not correct. You cannot say we're never meant to understand it, and this part of the Quran is just irrelevant for us. He says that's what he's trying to be careful of. You cannot say it's irrelevant. This ayah has nothing to do with us. He says no, it has a meaning. Sure, the Prophet and the Imams may know that meaning because they have the prereqs to go and access these meanings. But we are still being commanded to contemplate over them. And sometimes that contemplation is going to happen through us accessing the Prophet and the Imams, and they can tell us, what these ayat mean. Then he has a very lengthy explanation of Ibn Arabi's views. And I don't want to go through all of that, even though I actually highlighted the entire view of Ibn Arabi. It's very long. And they have their own language. But I want to just summarize. By the way, one thing he says about Ibn Arabi, which is interesting for me as well, is that he doesn't believe Yasin, in Surah Yasin, he doesn't believe Yasin is a disjointed letter. He says Yasin is actually munada, meaning when you're calling someone, like Ya Ali or Ya Shaykh. He says Yasin is basically a munada, and it is a munada for Ya Sayyid. Ya Sayyid. Just like he's saying, just like you say Ya Aba Hur, which is a way of saying Ya Aba Huraira. Likewise, Yasin for Ibn Arabi is that it is just saying Ya Sayyid. That's something that Agha Jawadi mentions over here. But what I want to summarize from Agha Jawadi is that, look, Ibn Arabi, so Ayatullah Jawadi is saying, look, the people who have access to mystical knowledge, they may be able to go and access what these ayat mean, and if they can present it to us, their explanation is not necessarily proof or binding for us, unless they can sort of rationalize it for us and we can understand it through the rational explanation. That's what he's saying. He says, Ahl shuhud, agar betwanan mashhudat khud ra ma'qul wa burhani konan, if the people of mysticism are able to present their mystical visions in a reasonable, rational way, which is, proven with certainty, then, at that point we can accept it, right? Otherwise, we cannot. And then he says that, look, the Quran calls itself a nur, considers itself light. And you cannot say that the entire Quran is nur, meaning its meanings are clear, meanings are known, but these ayat, these disjointed letters, we don't know what they mean. They are not nur. It's like you cannot say that. Therefore, the meanings of these ayat must also be known to at least some people who are not infallibles. You cannot just say that these ayat are just, nobody other knows, or just a few infallible, only they know, and no other human knows what these ayat mean. He says at least a level of their meaning must be known and accessible to some people. Of course, he is saying that people who can have mystical visions, they can go and they may be able to go figure it out. That's obviously an entire discussion, because Agha Jawadi has an entire different worldview on these topics, and many ulama don't agree with this whole shuhud and mystical vision, and whether it's even hujjah for themselves or not. There's a whole debate on that, but that's what I wanted to summarize. He concludes with the view of Ibn Arabi, and then he says the view of Ibn Arabi, if he can present it in a rational way, then it's evidence. If he cannot do that, then it's something that he witnessed, and it's not proof for us, basically. You can see the plethora of opinions on just the disjointed letters of the Quran. 20 plus technically opinions. There's more than 20, but Agha Jawadi has summarized most of them. But perhaps there are more. Maybe some of the Orientalists have come up with other opinions. But you can see that this is a very interesting discussion in the Quran. What are these disjointed letters? And it's something that we can really think about, because this is the part of the Quran, Alif Lam Mim. We read it in Surah Baqarah, we read in some of the surahs, we read in Surah Yasin all the time. Yasin, what does this mean? And why aren't the meanings of it known? Were the Sahaba not asking the Prophet about this? Were the Sahaba not confused? Like, what is the Prophet saying? What do these letters mean to them? This is a discussion that has existed, and from the very early on, Mufassirin of the Quran have been trying to figure out what these ayat mean, and you can see there's a wide variety of opinions. But what I want to show here with Agha Jawadi's take is how he is differentiating between what actually is proof and what actually just sounds good. And this is something that is a methodology that we should learn. Sometimes things just sound good and we are very tempted to just believe in them. Yeah, they sound good. It must be that must be the answer. But there are many places where he himself pointed out that, okay, yeah, this view it sounds good, but that's not proof. All it does when something sounds good, all that happens to it is that it comes in the realm of possibilities. After that, you must bring some sort of an evidence, some sort of a contextual indicator that will take that opinion from the realm of possibility to the realm of acceptance and proof, and something that is actually true, and you can put your finger on it and say, this is what the ayah of the Quran means. So this is something that we wanted to talk about in today's dictations. Inshallah, I hope it was interesting. I know it was a lot of different opinions. You can always pause it and watch it later. You don't have to watch all of these in one go. And I'm sure many of you are probably watching these on a faster speed as well. So this one, you might have to slow it down a little bit to watch it. I will reference the translation. I have also translated not a complete translation, but like an abridged translation of this discussion back in 2015, I believe 2016. So I will share that in the description below. I will timestamp these as well. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you drop your comments, and inshallah we will see you all in a future video. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.